Okay. Man. So HBO got big mad at me and blocked my live videos, so I gotta turn my volume down. But basically, or actually, yeah, okay, so I muted it. All right, so basically, end of World War II. Okay, this is what I was talking about because I think this is like a good chapter of American history that a lot of people um, eulogize and kind of like make devout in our culture when it doesn't necessarily deserve it. So there's this story. If you went to public school like me, there's this story of we were going to bomb the Japanese at the end of World War II, and several days beforehand, we flew over Nagasaki and Hiroshima and dropped pamphlets into the population that basically said, "Hey, we're going to bomb you, and so if you value your life, you should leave. And our quarrel is not with you. Our quarrel is with the Japanese government. And so we are very upset that they won't agree to our terms, the terms of surrender that we've set. And so we're warning you now. Here in a couple days, we're going to bomb you." Because the idea being, we're just going to level the property that the Japanese government owns. We're not going to kill a bunch of Japanese people because that would be wrong, right? Well, it turns out that story didn't happen. That's not true. That never happened. We didn't warn them beforehand. Hundreds of thousands of mostly women and children were instantly vaporized by us dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the reason that we all believe that that happened is because there was a movie made that was, if not wholly, partially funded by the United States government, that created this fiction. That there were two lies in this movie. One was that we flew over Hiroshima and Nagasaki and dropped these pamphlets and warned everybody. And the second was that as we were flying into Japanese airspace, we were under fire. Neither of these things are true. They did not happen. And so the story that ended up being, prevalent in our history classes ended up kind of morphing into this game of telephone where, well, we really didn't want to drop the nuke. And we really didn't want to create this situation where hundreds of thousands of mostly women and children were going to die of instant heat death. When in reality, that's not true at all. And the only conditions for surrender that the Japanese made in order to avoid being bombed, essentially, or in order to not prolong the war any farther, was that they wanted to keep their system of government. They wanted to be able to say, they wanted to be able to keep their emperor, essentially. They didn't want the United States and the Western world to come in and interfere in their government after the war. Which you could say is reasonable or not. I mean, that's really up to you. But the point being, they were interested in ending the war. They wanted to surrender to us. They had offered us terms. They had offered us conditions. And we said, no, that's not good enough. And we bombed. I believe we bombed Hiroshima first, but somebody can correct me. I'm pretty sure we bombed Hiroshima first. And Hiroshima was hundreds of miles away from the nearest military installment. It was a largely civilian population. And as a matter of fact, because Japanese had conscription at the time, and because the Japanese were deployed into the Pacific and into to the war to fight us mainly, and the European forces, the Allied forces, the men were home. And so what ended up happening was we dropped the most powerful weapon ever developed by the hands of man onto a civilization of mostly women and children, and instantly vaporized hundreds of thousands of people. And then when that wasn't good enough, we did it again in Nagasaki. Again, forgive me if I had that backwards. But when that wasn't good enough, we did it again in Nagasaki. And also a largely non-military target, mostly women and children, mostly completely innocent people that, in the same way that you and I and just regular people aren't involved in the decisions that get us into Iraq, these people didn't make the decisions to end up in World War II fighting with the Germans. And so we vaporize these people. Now, where this plays into what John Oliver is talking about here is that the entire theory of how we got taught this in U.S. history came from this movie that was largely sponsored and financed by the federal government. But when journalists at the time, and photojournalists and journalists at the time, tried to get into Japan to figure out what we had done and get an idea of the casualty count, what the damage looked like, what it was going to look like for these people in the future, we had an office of censorship, a federal office of censorship in this country that was basically designed to protect troop movements and war secrets and information about troop placement and all that kind of stuff so that we could, operational security, essentially. And when journalists would go out there, it was a legal requirement that the journalists who were in Japan would have to submit all of their photos and all of their field reporting through this office of censorship, essentially. I forget what it's called. But anyway, this office of censorship that we had set up under the guise of national security, and we need to make sure that we are protecting, the position of our troops and the safety of our soldiers that are overseas and stuff like that. And so they were required to turn in their reports to this office. And guess how much of that information made it out of there? Zero. And so largely, most of the United States population was completely unaware of the amount of devastation, not only the amount of devastation, but the type of people, being mostly women and children and innocent people, that were vaporized instantly by a nuclear warhead, by an atomic bomb. Twice. And what that led to was the public education narrative being that, hey, we had to do this. This had to happen. We had to drop the bomb on these people, because if we hadn't have dropped the bomb on these people, they could have invaded America. They were planning an American invasion, right? And so we bombed them over there so that they wouldn't come and hit us over here. Does that sound familiar? And it turns out that that's another thing that just comes completely out of this Hollywood movie fictional project of a movie that largely bombed and made no money in a time where very few movies were made, and in a time where every movie made a lot of money. This movie didn't make that much money. It wasn't very successful, even though it was packed with all the current Hollywood stars and it was a big deal. It was mostly a flop. But that movie served the purpose of setting the narrative for an entire generation of people post-World War II. And so we all grew up, you did, if you're anywhere around my age, you grew up with the story that we just had to do it. Oops, we had to do it. We had to do it. It was in the interest, yes, we vaporized a certain amount of people, but that was less people that would have been, completely obliterated by the Japanese invading America or them retaliating in some way. And so we vaporized hundreds of thousands of people because we could. So anyway, we're going to attempt to keep watching this. I hope that it doesn't break again. I'm going to leave the sound off so I don't get NSA destroyed by HBO. Yeah. Okay, so I actually had this conversation with somebody the other day. The Koh-i-Noor diamond is the most valuable diamond in the world, if I remember correctly. It's worth $100 million. It was completely stolen from India. Just completely stolen. And it now sits in, it's in the crown. It is in the crown jewels. And on their website, he's saying that it was presented to the Queen of England. Presented to her. Which is, of course, absurd. As we all know. Okay, yeah, so this is the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So for those of you who are wondering how this happened, he's about to walk through it. The United States, yeah. So basically, these were just a bunch of women, because in the early 20th century, and especially after World War II, there was an interest in shaping U.S. history in a way that fit a certain narrative. And so people were very interested in writing textbooks and creating a public school system where it was America was the hero in all the stories, which in reality is a natural course of thinking, right? It's a natural course of like. All right, let's see if HBO yells at me again. But anyway, I flipped it and there's no sound. So okay, so she's reading out of a textbook. She, quote, "Many slaves were hard workers and loved the work that they did, and they loved their cabins and the plantation, as if they actually owned them. Others were lazy, disobedient, and sometimes vicious." This is the way that your children are going to school and learning about slavery, man. Think about that for a second. We're going to, I'm going to fast forward a little bit. Or not fast forward, but speed this up a little bit. Because if I can't play the audio without Mark Zuckerberg freaking out, then I might as well just narrate it for you as he goes. Yeah, so the point that he just made is a very, 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 very valid one. The people who did this, the people who put this into our textbooks, that's, you know, some slaves were good, and slaves were bad, and slaves immigrated here, and all that kind of stuff. The people who have put this in our textbooks are now, or the people who read this in their textbooks after the Daughters of the Confederacy lobbied for it to be in public school education, those people are now, you know, they grew up in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and who are they now? They're the people that run this government. And whether it's through their fault or not, right, that they have these brainworms that make no fucking sense whatsoever, they are running the country with these insane ideas. Some U.S. settlers brought slaves to Texas to help work the fields. Oh, God. Woo-wee. I think I can turn the sound on.
To get updated versions of textbooks, and some work really hard to correct poor materials, but others actually make things even worse with tone-deaf assignments and classroom exercises that you may be familiar with from seeing local news stories like these.
This is the activity in question. It asks students to choose to be a slave or a slave owner, and then write a journal entry that is
Insane. Completely insane.
provides daily activities before the Civil War.
The question about slavery read, you own a plantation or farm, and therefore need more workers. Set your price for a slave. These could be worth a lot.
This North Carolina grandmother couldn't believe the assignment given to her fourth grader.
Bro!
The game is called Escaping Slavery. A slavery-themed Monopoly-like game students played in elementary school. Children worked in...
Do a word math problem based on how much you would pay for a slave.
Small groups got this freedom punch card. If the group ran into trouble, the card said they'd be severely punished and sent back to the plantation to work as a slave. Are they going to hang them? Are they going to kill them?
What the fuck are you doing there? You can't reduce a person's freedom from slavery down to what is basically a Jimmy Jones punch card. And just imagine what it would feel like to be a black kid in that classroom. Or, if you don't have to imagine, remember. Because it's not just their history there.
Okay, right. So he's landing on something that's really, really important that people fail to understand. Every major city that you walk down, the street in, there is a Robert E. Lee Elementary School. There is a statue of Andrew Jackson. There is this type of shit in public schools where black kids are taught, like... Here, hold on. I'll mute him for a second. We'll keep going. Because I don't want to be here all night. Anyway. There is assignments and shit that make black kids feel like the descendants of slaves. It's actively thrust upon them. This dude went to OU. Yeah, this dude went to OU in 1998. And he's from Oklahoma. He's from Tulsa. And he had no idea that Black Wall Street existed. He's from Tulsa, and he went to OU. And he had no idea until he took an African American studies class in probably his junior year of college that Black Wall Street existed. I mean, fam. Like, think about the implications of that. I mean, not only are you a citizen of this country with no idea of what your actual heritage is, because you... Yeah, he's making the point that, like, fam, dinosaurs were alive 65 million years ago. And my 7-year-old... excuse me. My 7-year-old knows the name of every single dinosaur on planet Earth. But Black Wall Street was 60 years ago? And this dude had... This well-educated guy that had probably taken 2 years worth of college courses at this time, had no idea it ever existed, and grew up in the town where it was. Insane! Insane! Will be perverted to turn your kids into mini Ilhan Omars. Okay, this is a point that needs to be made. Ilhan Omar has become this, like, insane caricature on the right. People have turned Ilhan Omar into, like, some terrorist that has invaded our country and is trying to rot us out from the within because she's a congressperson. Let me tell you something about Ilhan Omar. Ilhan Omar was a refugee. She grew up in a refugee camp. She grew up in some of the most impoverished, horrific conditions on the face of this earth. And, you know, these people like Laura Ingraham, who is an actual Nazi, Laura Ingraham, and these people on Fox News want to go around every day and tell you America's about picking yourself up by your bootstraps. No matter what happens to you, you work hard, you take care of business, and you really, like, make it happen, right? That's what America's all about. Ilhan Omar was born, I think she was born, but she was definitely raised in a refugee camp. And immigrated to America and became a United States citizen, and in her time as a United States citizen, became a sitting representative who has been reelected by an overwhelming majority in a community that it looks like her. She represents a district that has a large Somali population. And this is an African American woman that picked herself up by her bootstraps, as they like to say, and got to work, moved to America, worked her ass off and got an education, and then ended up being elected by people in her district to go and represent the American people. And these people on Fox News will tell you that she is some sort of, like, terrorist Trojan horse or whatever. Ilhan Omar is a personification of the American dream. Sorry. I know that, like, as Ben Shapiro would say, facts don't care about your feelings. Like, that's a fact. She overcame unbelievable odds to be a United States representative. And it's, you know, it's not like she's fucking Nancy Pelosi, who's a 100 millionaire and just, like, chilling. Nah, she worked hard. Yeah. So he's saying the Constitution is an imperfect document. The Declaration of Independence, an imperfect document. Yeah. Gone with the Wind. Dr. Seuss. I read that book to my kids. That's If I Ran the Zoo. I've been running around here singing Thomas Jefferson's praises. I didn't realize he was the R. Kelly of his time. Thomas Jefferson was a prolific slave rapist. Prolific slave rapist. Yeah, the point that he just made is exactly the point. The less that you know about history, the easier it is for you to say that you were on the right side. Right? Like, white people like to run around and say, yeah, okay, I'm going to pause this here. White people like to run around and say that they're not racist. And that's probably true. You know, that's the white people that you know like to run around and say that they're not racist. And yeah, that's probably very, very true. That the majority, we've talked about this before, did not elect a black man by an overwhelming majority twice in a row, and then all of a sudden everybody is a racist. That's not what happened. But if the same white people who tell you that were born in 1780 or 1820, don't you think that their views of black people based on the way that society was set up would be different? My great-grandfather owned slaves. My great-grandfather owned like 70-something slaves. Do I disagree with that? Of course. Do I think that that's just horrible behavior, that, like, Jesus Christ, that's terrible? Of course. But slavery was a part of American society. And so this idea that we can sit here as white people and say, well, I'm against slavery, and nobody alive is a slave, and therefore, like, you know, ultimately I'm on the right side, and it all worked out, right? Because the point that he just made is, the way that we teach history in schools is country founded, slavery, country founded with, you know, we were all very apprehensive about, you know, it was just those crazy Southerners that were like, hey, we got to keep slavery. And we were all very apprehensive about keeping slavery, and we were very upset that we had to codify that into law, and we really regretted it. And so several years later, we did nothing about it. People forget that, you know, a lot of people like to romanticize the fact that Thomas Jefferson tried to get rid of slavery in the Declaration of Independence, right? But they had another crack at it not 10 years later with the Constitution. They could have said, hey, screw this is a bad institution, let's get rid of it, because at the time the rest of the world was abolishing it, and America was one of the last places where slavery was still a thing, and we were driving the bus. We were driving the trade, the slave trade at that time, and the rest of the world, most of Europe, that wasn't England. I think England still had slaves for a little longer than the rest of Europe, but mostly Europe had denounced this as a horrible practice and gotten rid of it. And we were the ones that were driving the slave trade long after most of the world had moved on. And that's the reason that we ended up in a situation where the majority of American commerce and the baseline of, like, how we built the economy that, like, we all enjoy, how we got so far ahead. We got so far ahead because we had all of this free labor. And so the prosperity that you enjoy and the ability to be the number one superpower in the world comes from the idea that we had all that free labor for decades, and extra decades after everybody else didn't. And so the way that we teach this in public schools is apprehension about slavery at the Declaration of Independence, certainly apprehension about slavery at the Constitution, and then just 80 years of, like, well, you know, this is the way the world works, and then Civil War, all the slaves are freed, and then 80 years of a little bit of a hard time, and, you know, we had to have separate drinking fountains and ride on separate buses and stuff like that. But then, you know, Civil Rights Act and racism in America just ended. It just went away, and everything's been smooth sailing since then, which is nonsense. I read a tweet the other day that said we might have given away all of the gains that the civil rights movement, and I don't know that I totally agree with this, but I think we're headed there. All of the gains that we made in the civil rights movement, and all of the yes that we did by signing the Civil Rights Act and equal protection under the law and all that kind of stuff, that we have probably lost the vast majority of that progress by now. Okay, so right now he's telling the story of Wilmington, North Carolina, where there was majority black elected leaders, and they ran the government. And a couple hundred white dudes got together and staged the only coup that has ever happened on American soil. And I bet that you don't know this, unless you've seen this. The only coup that has ever happened on American soil was perpetrated by white people who went in and murdered the entire leadership of Wilmington, North Carolina, and burned most of the town to the ground because they didn't want black people to be in charge. Oh, he's about to tickle a very, very important thing. Okay, so he's making the point that, yes, Martin Luther King had the March on Washington, and it was a lot about racial justice and making sure that we provided for people who were... Oh, yeah, Brooke, it's probably me, because I'm trying to do too many things at once, I'm sure. Here, anyway. So... one day I'm going to get this down. But anyway, we're going to power through. So, there was a... man. I'm really not a fan of this. Ooh, I'm green. Okay, maybe that helps. Hopefully that helps. Okay. Anyway... maybe I should start recording these and then just posting them instead of doing them live. But oh well, it doesn't matter. What was the point that I was making? I've lost my train of thought now. Oh yeah. Okay, so he's about to tickle my little socialist bone here because Martin Luther King, one of the greatest accomplishments in the history of the right wing, and we'll end this here. We don't have to watch the rest of what John Oliver's talking about. But Martin Luther King, mostly, yes, his mission was we've got to get equal rights for people in this country, right? That was his idea of what my son is on his phone and I was just alerted of this.
No, it's me.
Oh, it's you. Okay. So, Martin Luther King, right? Martin Luther King's main thrust of his movement was... Oh my god, what the heck is happening in my camera? This is terrible. This is horribly. I think I'm really trying to get too fancy and I'm breaking my shit. Green. I'm green again. Oh my god, now I'm big. Anyway, if this works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Whatever. From now on, I'm just going to record these, I think. But anyway, so Martin Luther King's main thrust was yes, we have to get racial justice and equality for people. We have to make sure that across the spectrum, black, white, brown, orange, yellow, whatever, we have to make sure that people are treated equally under the law, because that is the foundation of how our country was set up, and really that's what we're striving to do as a nation, right? And what we've always been striving to do as a nation according to the way that we teach history in this country. And so the idea being that he was going to march on Washington, and he was going to basically demand this, right? One of the most successful things that the right wing has accomplished over the past, I don't know, 50, 60 years, is that they have been able to convince people that that was Martin Luther King's only mission, was that he was going from church to church and basically telling people that we had to be equal among the races, and that would solve everything in America. When what Martin Luther King was really doing was telling people that, like, no, yes, there is a racial component to the inequities that are in the American system. But, more accurately, there is a class component. And when we are out spending hundreds of millions of dollars on foreign wars and all type of just exploratory nonsense, and we're spending all sorts of money on cutting people's taxes and making sure that people, rich people, are just flush with cash, and that corporations are able to grow without regulation, then what happens is regular people get stomped on. And this was, if you read the letter from Birmingham jail that Martin Luther King wrote, this was the main thrust of his mission. The Poor People's Movement. You can hear Killer Mike talk about this. The Poor People's Movement, and making sure that people were provided for on a material level. Because his idea was, if you provide for people on a material level... Hold on, I'm going to fix this. If you provide for people on a material level, then you can work out the rest of it later. You can make people whole. Tori taught me a trick earlier. Maybe I can do... Oh, look at that. Look at that. You can see me. Hey, I'm not so grainy and horrible. So, like I said, Martin Luther King's main thrust was like, we have to provide for people on a material level. And if we can't do that, then racial justice doesn't matter. Because you can have black people and white people and brown people and everybody else able to use whatever bathroom they want and drink out of the same water fountains and, like go into the same public spaces and be represented in movies and, whatever the hell. And break all of these glass cultural ceilings. But if you don't provide for people's material needs, and you don't actually back that up with things like healthcare and jobs, and a means for these people to be able to provide for themselves, and a means for these people to be able to, do a day's work and earn a day's wage, and be able to put food on the table for their kids, and all that type of shit, then what you end up with is a system that is still inequitable, by race or otherwise. It still doesn't work. And so Martin Luther King's main thrust in his mission was economic equity, the equality of opportunity, where no matter where you were born, no matter where you were educated, no matter who your parents were, no matter what the color of your skin was, all of these bullet points that he hit, you had an economic opportunity to be able to go out into the world and work a full-time job and raise a family on that wage. And if you wanted your significant other to stay home and raise your children in the meantime, then you would have the money to be able to provide for that. And you would have the security and the health care to be able to provide for that. And one of the greatest successes of mostly the right wing, but also the neoliberals in this country over the last half a century, is that they have been able to convince that people that didn't happen. That Martin Luther King just had a dream about how black people should be equal to white people. And that was part of it, of course. And a noble cause, of course. But it wasn't the entire thrust of Martin Luther King. And I would be willing to place money on the fact that if Martin Luther King had spent his entire life just saying black people should have the same rights as white people, and look how mistreated black people are, he would either, I don't know how old he would be right now, but he would have lived to be a very old age. Because there is a third rail in American society that you are not allowed to touch as an outspoken individual, or as a protester, or as someone who is trying to affect change in your community. And that third rail is economic justice. That third rail is materially providing for people who need actual things. They don't need you to symbolically talk to them about injustice. They don't need you to pander to them about how police are mean. They don't need you to give them things like affirmative action or provide them with... Now, granted, it's helpful, but they don't need you to provide special programs where you got to fill out 57 different forms so that you can get a government benefit of some kind. What they need is a basic safety net of material things that are going to make their life safer, more secure, and just generally more or less stressful. And if you look back into American history, the people who asked for these things did not necessarily make it to an old age. These visions were shared by Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, John F. Kennedy. The fact that, I mean, what do those people have in common, right? Like, the fact that this has become the meme about what these people stood for is just a bunch of pandering to these identity wokeness is really a betrayal of their legacy and really a betrayal of what these people stood for. And so it's important in the context of this John Oliver clip, and like I said, tomorrow I'll figure out a better way to stream this, but in the context of this John Oliver clip, is he's basically saying, like, if we don't know these things as a society, and if we don't raise our children with these ideas, then it will creep back up on us 40, 50, 60, 70 years from now, when these children are eventually of the age that they are making all of the decisions and writing all of the laws and having all of the debates that matter to people's material lives. You see this in effect in post-war Germany. In Germany, it is illegal to fly a Nazi flag. It is illegal to own Nazi memorabilia. It is illegal to display any sort of admiration or affection for Hitler and the Nazi Party. Why? Because that is a part of their history that if they can educate people on it and on the slippery slope of what happens when you start to put your faith in people like that, when you actually make the effort to tell people that is bad consistently, and you teach children that that is bad consistently as a society, and most of your society comes together and condemns these things, they generally do not get repeated. And so there is a value to good, bad, indifferent, teaching people about the actual founding of this country, teaching people about the actual problems that arose in the past from the way that we chose to start this thing. And that there is going to be a reckoning at some point, whether it's in my lifetime or in my children's lifetime or in their children's lifetime, that actual reckoning is going to happen. That an actual understanding of what happened and some sort of reconciliation about the fact that we propped the first 200 years of the existence of this country on the backs of people who never got paid for it. And not only never got paid for it, but died and were tortured for the pleasure. And this plays into the entire idea of, like, black people having to live in this society as it is today. Because everything that we've just talked about is bookended by the idea that the police in this country were started to catch runaway slaves. It's the reason that we have law enforcement in this country. is to catch runaway slaves. And when we got rid of slavery, the police needed something to do. So you know what they moved on to? And this dovetails perfectly into the Martin Luther King message. When slavery was over and they needed something else to do, they went on to say, well, there are some workers. Somebody said in the chat, just tuning in, I'm going to guess the talk is trying to convince a boomer that Trump is a horror show. I actually talked about that yesterday and forgot to change the titles today. But the talk is actually just completely ignoring boomers entirely because they are unsavable. They cannot be saved. Their minds cannot be changed. There might be a couple that you can scrape off, but there is no actual political benefit to doing it because even if you could convince the people who have already decided that Trump isn't a horror show, even if you could scrape them off and get them to vote for Joe Biden, we're talking about such a small number of people that who gives a shit. But anyway, so when they got done, when slavery was outlawed and the police decided we need something to do, their next purpose was to go around and bust unions and worker organizations and strikes. And they were either directly paid by oligarchs and huge moneyed interests, or indirectly paid to go out and crack people's skulls because they were asking for things like a living wage or reasonable hours or safe working conditions. And the idea that law enforcement has always been a force for good in the history of this country and has never done anything wrong and has never been part of upholding a system that has oppressed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, is completely and utterly absurd. It requires you to ignore the entire history of this country. It requires you to just completely write off most of the decisions that we have made from a governing standpoint for about 150 years. And so we need to, I'm reading, and we'll talk more about this on later streams because I haven't read enough. I haven't read enough yet for us to really talk about it, and I know I'm late to the game on this, but I'm reading Chris Hayes' book, A Colony in a Nation, and I have some disagreements with Chris Hayes in general, but before he caught the MSNBC brainworm, he was doing really, really good journalism, and even does some now. I think he's the only person on the channel that is really able to do actual journalism, or what they would call journalism. And, unlike the lead-in for his show, which is just a complete nutcase. I mean, Rachel Maddow's completely lost her mind. But, I'm in the middle of reading A Colony in a Nation, and like I said, we'll talk about it more later, but the point being, and I'll end on this note, the point being that there are two different experiences for people in this country with the police. If you are affluent, and it helps if you're white also, it helps a lot if you're white, but definitely if you're affluent, and you have an encounter with the police, right? That encounter is generally peaceful, uneventful, pretty customer servicey. You kind of, the problem is handled, and then you leave that situation most of the time. Whereas if you are poor, and particularly if you are poor and black in this country, your experience with the police is mostly violent and alienating. And the same people that have lined up on the right in this country to evangelize the founding fathers about how they were under the thumb of British rule, and the colonies were being taxed without representation, and the colonies were being oppressed by law enforcement, which were British forces and the British Crown. And they just had to take up arms, right? They had no choice because they were being treated unfairly. They were being forced into social situations that were incredibly dangerous for them. People were being killed in the streets, and by people who were supposed to uphold the law. And in that situation, the story always goes, well, they had to, the tree of liberty has to be watered with the blood of patriots and tyrants or whatever the hell, right? And so these people had to rise up, and they had to break free of the British Crown and form a new nation because they were being treated unfairly by their government at the time. Well, the argument that Chris Hayes is making in this book is that black people live in a colony. They live in a colonized environment. They live in an environment where they are being governed by people who don't look like them, mostly, who don't experience life in the same way that they do, who don't come from their community 95% of the time. And so they are being policed by a hostile force that is trying to maintain order, which is basically just peace and quiet for all the white folk. And they don't have the level of representation commensurate with the number of them that there are. And they don't have any representation that is pointing out that this is a problem on a mass scale. And so they have been colonized within the nation that they are supposed to live in freely. And just like at the time when the British owned the colonies, they would allow citizens of the colonies to be representatives at either in Britain at Parliament, John Adams was one of them, or as royal governors of their colonies, and representation on as city magistrates and shit like that. And so whenever someone is colonizing a group of people, they throw them a bone with a little bit of representation here and a little bit of representation there, and make them feel like they have a say in the rule that they are under and in the thumb that they are being squished under. When in reality,